Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our program, The Key to Diversification, episode 17. My name is Mandy Chen, head of IQI International Sales, and I'm the host for this program. Just a bit of the background of myself. I've been involved in international marketing for more than 8 years, and myself as an investor have diversified my investment portfolio to the countries like Australia, Thailand, and UK. So our program, The Key to Diversification, is designing for those whom keen to explore in the international property investment and wanted to diversify their investment portfolio by hedging against the currency and inflation, but do not know how to go about it. So with this program, we will share with you some of the fundamental investment guidelines based on the country, the do and the don't when investing abroad. Besides, we will provide some of the market outlooks and the fundamental of the global real estate industry so that you have a better understanding of the various property market around the globe. So again, you will discover that investing abroad is actually not that difficult after all, as some of the countries, their investment policy is rather friendly and easy for foreigners. So we have been running for this program for more than 16 episodes, and usually we will invite different panel speakers from various countries whom they are qualified professional or real estate specialists around the globe. And they are able to share with you their experience and knowledge as an investor or as a professional by giving some of the investment tips to guide you through your investment diversifications. Without further ado, let me welcome Mr. Joshua Daniel from Aticus Law Solicitors to share with us the essential guide on the UK law on the real estate. Hi, Joshua.
Hi, Mandy. Thank you very much for having me. I've been incredibly fortunate. Some really fantastic projects, working at Aticus Law, I've been able to work on some truly incredible projects, from everything from the 100-unit student accommodation deal we've got completing next month to number 1 Old Trafford, which is a £73 million residential development we've been working on for about 18 months now. So yeah, been part of some very exciting projects, and yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Great. Okay, so let's have a bit of the discussions when it comes to the general stage of investing in UK property. So do you want to elaborate further on this?
In terms of the general stage of investing in UK property, especially in relation to your off-plan purchases where the property hasn't yet been built, it's a little bit more complicated, but the stages are fairly straightforward. They effectively go reservation, where your solicitor will receive the initial details of the sale and perhaps any searches that are to be provided. We've got the second stage, which is title review, which is the due diligence process that will undertake to ensure the property is what's known as good and marketable. And then you have the inquiry stage, which is where the seller solicitors will answer any questions that the buyer solicitors have about the title or perhaps the condition of the property being purchased. And it's not till all of these have been considered that we move towards exchange of contracts.
Okay.
So that's effectively an outline in relation to the different stages. But when you're invested in property, especially in the UK, it's really key to view the purchase as a whole rather than in specific stages. Whilst you might have certain tasks that you need to undertake to progress the purchase, it's important not to lose sight of what you're trying to achieve overall. And I've always encouraged clients to let me know right at the outset what it is they're looking for, and then obviously we can build on that. So
which you always offer this kind of service to the investors, be it whether they are in UK or just around the globe, right?
Yeah, we deal with a number. We act on behalf of both the developer and a number of investors, depending on the scheme being put forward at the time. But we've represented buyers from all over, not just in the UK.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, is there any difference between the different sectors, let's say, for example, residential versus the commercial in terms of the law? What do the investor needs to be mindful when it comes to investing in UK properties?
There's a number of legalities that will apply across the sector that obviously your solicitor will advise you upon at the time. So these include the Landlord and Tenant Acts, the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation Act, and an array of others that your solicitor will explain to you, obviously, in due course. But added considerations definitely need to be given if you're investing in residential property that needs a considerable amount of refurbishment work doing to it. An HMO, which is a house in multiple occupation, or potentially even in the commercial sector. And the reason that I say this is because when investing in projects that require a great deal of refurbishment work, special consideration usually needs to be made if you're going to be buying using a mortgage. Now, the reason I say this is because a number of lenders simply just won't lend if the property isn't considered to be habitable at the time. So it's really important to make sure your due diligence is done at that time if you're investing or potentially looking for alternative means of financing the purchase. Additionally, if you're going to be buying an HMO, which is a property where there's multiple households and shared amenities, you might find yourself subject to licensing requirements. This can involve having the property inspected, paying a fee, and providing all the applicable certificates, the electrical safety, fire alarms, and all that other fun stuff before it can be rented out. So that's another area that you've got to be slightly more diligent on before commencing, obviously just making you aware of before you're going into it. And lastly, of course, we've got commercial property. Now, when investing in commercial property, one of the biggest factors I see investors miss is VAT, which is value-added tax. Now, ordinarily, commercial property is exempt from VAT, but a seller can actually enter into what's known as an option to tax, which effectively allows them to charge VAT on the purchase price for a period of time. So you find that investors are entering into these kinds of contracts unaware of the fact that VAT may be payable, and that can significantly alter the purchase price. So especially in relation to commercial property, it's a really big consideration to have before moving further down the line and perhaps incurring more expense.
All right. So is that more complicated when it comes to compared to you purchase the residential properties versus the commercial properties, whereby there's more documentations required, more duties that required to do?
It totally varies, to be perfectly honest, in relation to residential and commercial property. You've got some very straightforward commercial transactions because since 2002, all property in the UK is now registered with the land registry. So your solicitor will receive a title document that will go through all the different aspects of the property, will enclose with it any leases that are applicable or charges, that type of thing. So it ultimately comes down to what's registered on the title as opposed to the nature of the transaction as to how complicated it may be. Ultimately, without avoiding the question, it depends.
Okay, so when talk about due diligence, right? So normally, as a solicitor, so you will actually provide such service to the clients rather than they have to do it on their own, right?
Yes, yeah, of course. The due diligence in itself can take many forms. It's effectively the process where your solicitor will review all the available documentation and advise you on key aspects of the transaction. As to why it's so important, there are a number of aspects of one's due diligence which, if not accounted for, can start to add to the cost of the acquisition or actually result in the purchase falling through. One of the key ones that I'm seeing regularly kind of in recent years is that ground rent is being overlooked by these investors. Now, as you know, ground rent is quite a nominal sum. It could only be £250 a year, but that's what's leading it to being overlooked. And what people aren't realising is that if the ground rent is above a certain amount or there's onerous ground rent review provisions, what you find is that some mortgage companies won't lend in relation to those types of ground rent provisions. So it's something to be really considerable of when you're going through your due diligence stage. Similarly, due diligence is considered when considering whether or not the highways and drainage benefits in the property are what's called adopted. So adopted effectively means that they're maintained at the expense of the local authority, most of the owner. So I'm seeing more and more reports, certainly those purchasing new build homes in recent months, of people saying they're actually aware they were liable to the repair of the roads outside the property. So it's a really key part of your due diligence because that can significantly affect your return on investment. And effectively, the moral of the story is when you receive your report on title from your solicitor, so make sure you read it thoroughly and raise anything that you're not quite sure of, because effectively that's what they're there to help with.
Yep. Okay. So thanks for those who just joined us. And today we are talking about the investments law on the real estate in UK. So thanks for tuning in. So if you have any questions for Joshua, so remember to actually put down in the comment box. We will try to answer it after our sections. All right. So remember, any questions, feel free to ask. All right. So of course, a lot of buyers may feel not so comfortable when it comes to negotiating on the property purchase, what kind of advice that you can actually give it to them? And is this service that you could offer to them as well? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that I find myself doing more and more in recent times. Oh, you still with me?
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
Can you still hear me? Good,
Hello?
good, good, good.
Yeah.
Sorry, just double checking, just double checking. Yeah, I'm seeing it more and more. Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm
no
seeing it
worries.
more and more that investors are asking us to negotiate, which is fine. But with that said, I would always advise when negotiating properties to have a firm idea in your head of, firstly, what your target return on investment is going to be, and secondly, the figures involved, whether it be what you consider to be the true value of the property or the cost of any refurbishment works. Once you know all the key figures, you can really assess and evaluate what margin there is for negotiation. So this in turn would allow you to make reasonable offers where the investment's a sufficient return for yourself, but equally you're not discouraging the seller by making unreasonable offers. So ultimately, the more information you can get at those kind of initial stages, that allow you to make a more educated decision.
Great. Okay, I understand that right now in UK, majority of the properties or the projects are in leasehold basis, and it's actually as high as like 250 years, and some is from 99 years onwards. And a lot of investors would say that what is the difference compared to the leasehold and the freehold properties?
Okay, so leasehold property was originally designed in relation to buildings like apartments where you've got communal areas. And what it effectively does is it grants the owner of that said apartment part of the freehold property. Okay, so you would grant occupation of a certain plot for a period of time. Now, this period of time is obviously shouldn't be reflective upon how long that individual is going to stay at the property because they're going to be purchasing it.
Yep.
So that's why the terms come in at 999 years, some are 250 years, and then there's automatic rights of renewal in relation to those once you get further down the term. So that's effectively what it is. It's a piece of land for a period of time that would qualify as leasehold property. Okay, and what you find is that in relation to leasehold property, there's an added layer of due diligence that needs to be undertaken. Primarily due to the fact that the terms of the lease need to be scrutinised to make sure they're in keeping with the intended use of the property. Ultimately, I mean, there's been a number of occurrences in recent years whereby investors are buying these stunning city centre apartments with the view of attaining returns on investment of nearly 30% by letting them on a short-term basis. So either through Airbnb or another provider. And what you're finding then is that was actually in breach of their lease. So it's certainly something that I would be advising on throughout the process. And I'd say a key component of due diligence is going to be involved in buying leasehold property surrounds the intended use and the restrictions imposed by the lease itself.
All right. Just to add on, it's comparing those that with a shorter lease compared to the longer lease. Would that be effect on the valuations of the properties?
So in relation to shorter leases, whilst you do have the automatic right of renewal under UK law, what you are finding is that mortgage lenders are wanting a greater term. So the more you can get towards that kind of 250 years, a lot of mortgage lenders are much happier to lend at that kind of rate. You do find that mortgage lenders are still able to lend at, say, 125 years upwards. But I'd say once you start to get below that kind of 100-year leasehold period, that's when lenders the term left in the lease and obviously want that extending before you enter into a facility agreement with them.
All right, but then it's kind of like standard in most of the UK, whereby a majority of the properties they come in leasehold. Even for locals, they don't mind buying up in the leasehold property, right? Can I say that?
No, not at all. Leasehold properties had a very, very mixed stance in the media, certainly recently. And that is usually in relation to the ground rent provisions that I spoke about earlier. With that said, leasehold is effectively, it's a necessary part because ultimately it's what's going to allow people to buy these stunning apartments that are going to rely on the structural integrity of the freehold to obviously grant them occupation of their individual unit. So whilst it's received some kind of mixed press recently, I would say it's still going to be the norm in relation to residential property in the UK moving forward, certainly in relation to apartment buildings and things of that nature.
All right. So when come to there's a mortgage required, as most of the investor will probably would not consider buying cash. They want to leverage on the bank and they want to get a mortgage. And at what point do you recommend an investor to approach a provider?
Certainly purchasing off plan, I would always recommend that an investor has an agreement in principle prior to exchange. This way, we said with greater certainty that the same investor will be able to finance the purchase on completion. What tends to try and be avoided is the possibility that a deposit's paid on exchange only to find that the residual amount can't be financed for whatever reason. So I would certainly say get your agreement in principle in early, and then it's a case of obviously progressing. When the progress of the build gets closer to completion, that's when you're going to start being back in contact with your mortgage lender to get a full relation to that particular purchase.
Okay, when normally come to the legal processings and all these things, normally it would take how long to complete the entire transactions?
Your average transaction in the UK for a property that's built is 6 to 8 weeks. Oh. Now, that can completely vary. I mean, we've had, I had one last week where the turnaround time had to be within 4 days, the entire process. So there's certain streamlined versions of things that you can do, and obviously you can expedite certain matters. But at the same time, the importance is to make sure that you're thorough. So when your solicitors it seems like taking an eternity to come back to you on different inquiries, obviously you've just got to be rest assured that they're doing the necessary due diligence to make sure that you're getting a good property.
All right. So would this affect during these pandemic periods?
What was that, sorry?
The process, is it affected during this pandemic period, whereby everyone was not working full time at this moment or work from home?
What you're finding, not necessarily from a legal standpoint in relation to the delays, what you found most of the delays, now when you're purchasing property, you'll undertake a number of searches beforehand. And what you're finding with these searches is that effectively the delays in relation to getting those search results back from the local authority was then starting to be extended. Now, as a result of that process being extended, obviously extended the entire time the transaction takes, because it's longer before they get back, before your solicitor can review them. So ultimately, I would say that would be the only thing. With that said, as a result, there's been some fantastic progressions in relation to indemnity policies for this type of thing, to indemnify you in the event of you not being able to get searches in time and things of that nature. So there's been developments as well as regressions as a result of the pandemic. All
right. Okay. One of the things that right now is the heat in especially in London. We are talking about the new stamp duty land tax that with effect from now till next year March. So what is this all about? Would you want to elaborate a little bit more on this?
Yeah, so stamp duty itself is the tax that you pay upon the purchase of a property. Now, stamp duty works on a tiered system, i.e. the higher the purchase price, the greater a percentage that you're paying over and above a certain amount. Now, from April 2021, there's a couple of considerations to be made in relation to stamp duty. Firstly, we have the conclusion of the currently amended thresholds, so these initial tiered systems. And secondly, we've got the potential surcharge that's being imposed for overseas buyers. Now, SDLT is currently calculated in accordance with this tiered system, which for residential investment properties means any investment below that £500,000 mark is subject to a lower rate of SDLT. However, from April next year, that same threshold is being reduced back down to 125,000, which of course increases the cost associated with the purchase. Additionally, April will also expected to see the imposition of a surcharge for these overseas investors of 2%. 2%. So the combination of these things, 2%, yeah. So the combination of these two things has seen levels of a UK investment increase quite significantly in recent months as overseas buyers, understandably, rush to complete their investments in order to take advantage of these stamp duty things. So you're finding a number of developers now pushing to make sure the completion can happen before the end of March this year.
So you must be very busy right now.
Incredibly busy at the minute, man. Incredibly busy.
Yeah,
it's all good. You'd rather be busy, but yeah, it's an incredibly intriguing and fascinating time to be in the property market.
That means it's local is also affected with this stamp duty holidays, and they are also rushing to buy into all around the UK as well, not just international buyers.
Yes, yeah, 100%. With the increase in that first threshold to 500,000, even domestic buyers are effectively rushing to get these transactions over the line in time to make sure that they can take advantage. What you're also finding now is that a number of developers are offering stamp duty incentives.
Oh,
so
really?
if it is dependent on whether or not their development will complete prior to that April cutoff, what they're offering now is effectively the incentive of saying, well, if you do have to incur additional stamp duty, we'll pay it on your behalf. And I'm seeing that more and more common across a couple of, especially the larger developments you've got. You're dealing with 300, 400, 500 units. It's typically imposed at that point to retain the buyers and obviously keep people investing. And I think that's why we've got such a busy period going at the moment.
All right. But roughly how much of savings that you're talking about?
In relation to into an investment property.
Yep.
So if you're looking to leverage using a mortgage, what you usually find is that your typical loan to value, so the loan the bank will give you in relation to the value of the property, is up to 75%. So that means that you've effectively got to have the cash available for 25% of the purchase price, plus, say, your additional legal costs and disbursements and all the rest of it. So obviously on an example, to keep it easy, £100,000 property, you're going to have 25 and then finance the rest.
All right. But in short, it's like when talk about buying costs, I mean, beside the down payment or whatsoever, what is the like the percentage they're talking about of the purchase price? Roughly how much they need to pay for whatever, including stamp duties, transfer fee or whatsoever, the legal fees. What is the roughly percentage that you're talking about when they want to purchase the investments?
Oh, you put me on the spot there,
Just a range.
You've got your 25% deposit. So depending on what deposit you're looking to put down, what element of it you're going to want to finance, you're putting 25% down. Then you've got your legal fees, which will be quite nominal, perhaps, including all of the disbursements. It'd be probably less than £1,000. And then you've got your stamp duty, which works out. So if you were purchasing at the moment, you're purchasing a residential property, okay, you'd be paying 3% first tier for stamp duty on tax. Okay. Now that means that for a £100,000 property, you'd be putting 25 down. You'd be say paying £1,000 in additional legal costs, and then you've got your £3,000 stamp duty. So to try and be as accurate as possible, 29%.
Oh, all right.
Seems to be a rough minimum. Obviously, that would change depending on the individual transaction.
Yeah, plus and minus, and depends on the purchase amount as well. I understand that. Don't worry about that. Yeah, that would be great. Okay. Beside that, anything else that you would like to advise our investor when to come to purchase of a property in the UK? What is the considering factors that which is the utmost importance?
In addition to what we've already discussed, I'd say, like any other investment, I would always advise clients to just attain and evaluate that against their investment criteria. Some investors may simply be looking to generate a good rental yield return over a period of time. Others may be looking for the property to increase in value, either by making improvements or holding it for a significant period of time. So in any event, it's really important that the property itself is in keeping with the goals and the expected returns that the investor has.
Okay. And of course, it's like, is that a must to obtain a view when we purchase the properties in UK? A view to take care of the inheritance tax or whatsoever, because there's the questions coming in.
Oh, okay. A vehicle?
A view. Do they need to write a
Oh,
will when they purchase a
ah,
property? Yes.
right, okay. Um, all I would say in relation to investment in UK is to weigh it up and balance it and take the view of any other key investment that you're going to make. And that is going to be weighing up mainly the key figures. The key figures are going to be the most important bit because that's going to see you right the way through. And the more an educated decision you can make on the key figures at the outset, that shows you the margin for negotiation. It shows you that if there's any additional costs that crop up, obviously that can then be factored into making sure you're still making a sufficient return or the investment still what you thought it was going to be at the outset. That's effectively, I would say, the view I would be taking, and that I advise clients to take is just to learn as much about the property itself before entering into the transaction. And then that way you've got a real educated view moving forward.
And I guess the most important thing is to actually leverage on the expertise from the solicitors, and they will be able to give you good advice. Otherwise, it's like you probably have will face a lot of problems when it comes to is not completed yet. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if there's any questions.
Yeah, you do fine.
Yep. Let me see if there's any questions. Okay, in order to enjoy the stamp duty saving by the deadline on 31st of March 2021, what is the estimated final date for signing the contract, the exchange of contract? Or have the land registered done? Or okay, you go ahead. Yeah, or have they get the land registry done before the deadline? Do they need to get the land registry to complete before the deadline, or they can actually do it before that or after the deadline?
Right. Okay. So with every transaction, you've got an effective date of completion, okay, or an effective date of transaction. Now, this date is going to be the completion of the transaction. So no matter when you exchange contracts or sign the contract itself, stamp duty is going to be payable upon completion of that purchase. So what you will find, especially in relation to investment properties, is that this is why the developer is trying to get these different properties over the line and complete, as in physically built, before the end of March to allow sufficient time for the legals to come in and physically complete on the transaction.
What if there's a lapse of the periods? That means the property was probably completed April or May 2021. Then what happened to the stamp duty? Will they still need to pay, or they will still get the exemptions?
So the stamp duty would then be paid on the higher amount in relation to once the obviously very much up in the air at the moment, especially in relation to the pandemic. There's no guarantees on what the UK government's going to do in relation to stamp duty. I know the likes of property developers like David Price and a couple of others have kind of thrown about the idea that stamp duty rates are going to stay as they are for an extended period of time. There's no guarantees at the moment, but in terms of, sorry, to answer your original question, in terms of that initial layover period, what you're finding is that provided you can get the effective date of the completion of your purchase before the end of March, then obviously you'll be able to benefit from the lower stamp duty rates.
Wow. So are you saying that is it safer to actually buy those completed projects, or going to complete it in probably like in end of this year will be safer instead of wait for the next year's completions? There will be a bit of the risk involved, right? Is that so?
There's certainly less involved in relation to dealing with, there's certainly less involved in relation to dealing with completed projects. With that said, it depends on the individual developer. And obviously, once you've done your initial due diligence and seeing that developer's track record, if it is incredibly likely that they're going to be completing before the end of March, then I wouldn't be ruling out certain potential investments on the basis that they might be completing early next year. Obviously, with that said, obviously the safest return is always going to be something that's currently built. But there are other mechanisms in place, such as the incentives that I discussed earlier, that developers are putting in place to keep investment going, even in the event that the stamp duty period passes.
Okay, based on your experience, there's a question that arrived that is there a lot of projects, especially that would they delay when it comes to completions period? Is there any delay when it comes to the estimate completion date?
It depends. With the developments I've been working on, I've been incredibly fortunate to work on developments that have completed primarily either on time or ahead of schedule. And I've also been very fortunate to work with some fantastic developers and construction firms. Mm-hmm. You do hear of other developers extending the period, but with that said, what your solicitor will always impose is a long stop date in terms of the contract. Mm-hmm. And that will be the date by which, effectively a target date for the developer to make sure it's complete at that time. So there will be financial implications of obviously not being able to meet a long stop date for the developer. But in my experience, most of these kinds of developments are either finished on time. I've been very fortunate in one case especially to have it complete ahead of time.
Okay, so of course, investor will ask that in the event there is any delay in terms of the delivery of the handover. So what kind of benefit as an investor will actually get it from the developer? Will there be any compensation plan that involved, or they will just have to wait for the building or the unit has been completed?
It depends on the nature of the individual contract itself, which is why it's so important to have a good working relationship with your solicitor who will obviously advise you on these points. So it depends on the individual contract that you're entering into. But what you find a lot of the time, especially in relation to projects where they've surpassed that long stop date that I mentioned earlier, mm-hmm. you find that buyers are able to withdraw from the property and have their deposit returned to them.
That is possible, right?
Process.
That is possible, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's quite a standard clause in relation to a number of the contracts. But again, it depends on the individual wording and what the developer solicitors has put in place before the investment actually comes in. So it's, as I said, it's really key to have that kind of good working relationship with your solicitor.
Okay, and in most of the time, the contract from the developer, especially you're talking about those off the plan, will the terms and conditions are standard, or can the investor request the solicitor to amend certain terms and conditions which they think that is not fair to them? Is that possible?
Yeah, you can certainly, and as you said, I mean, the worst thing that can happen is they'll say no, ultimately. And I've always, in any area, lived by that kind of motto. But with that said, what you do find, especially with these larger developments, is that a solicitor acting on behalf of the developer will mm-hmm. be processing anywhere, if it's a 350 unit development, you could be processing 2 or 3 documents in relation to every unit. So what they like to do, and I stress this, what they like to do is keep everything quite uniform across the board. With that said, there is always scope, obviously, in relation to individual units to have certain amendments to the terms and conditions, whether that be to make your investment conditional on your ability to get a mortgage, or whether it be, in terms of the certain dates that completion has to be undertaken by. But you will find it's usually quite uniform across the development.
All right. So especially those investor, they buy those off the plan from the developer. And normally, like you say, that especially those big developer or established developer, they have their own solicitors teams to look after. Would you advise, as an investor, do you advise that we should engage the third-party solicitors to look after the contracts, or we can actually use the same solicitors from the developer side? Which is a better way of handling this?
So you'd always have your own independent solicitors when you're dealing with purchase in the UK. A developer solicitor wouldn't be able to advise both the developer and yourself, because in the UK it's classed as what's called a conflict of interest. Mm. So you'd always have an independent solicitor acting for you, and they would then liaise with the developer solicitors. And at least that way, all the parties are going to be equally represented and obviously educated in relation to the different legalities and all the other fun stuff that applies to these kinds of investments.
Yeah, at least they're right. I mean, as a purchaser or as well as the developer side, they are well protected as well.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Certainly in accordance with the terms of the contract, what you find is that certain protections are in place. I know certainly personally, and I know another of other representatives that they're ensuring that certain warranties are going to be in place, especially in relation to the payments of deposits, to make sure the funds are protected in the event of things like insolvency or non-completion of the bill.
Okay. And of course, there's another question that coming in that they was checking on the so-called deposits, the down payment, and certain developer will request about at least like 10 to 20%, and some can ask for 25 to about 40%. So can you negotiate for these terms, or it depends on the developer side as well?
Again, it's incredibly subjective in relation to each individual development. What you do find is that there is room to negotiate these types of things. But again, I would say the most crucial part is to evaluate what aspect of the investment that you're looking to get out of this. You know, depending on the type of investment, if you are looking to invest off plan, then obviously there's going to be other considerations that need to be made in relation to the deposit to make sure that that is a protected investment. I think a lot of what a lot of investors overlook is that rather trying to just get the deposit as low as possible, you're wanting to get the deposit to a level that is protected by the developer. So that's either having it protected by a warranty provider and having evidence of that warranty, or having the developer solicitors hold the money as what's called stakeholder, which is where they don't release the funds to the developer, they hold it, what's known as stakeholder, to effectively protect those funds in the event of
I think it's always safer to actually put as a stakeholder rather than vice versa, right?
Yeah, so what you find especially is quite standard in relation to these contracts is that the funds will be held as stakeholder, and they will be what's called released as agents, so released to the developers for them to be able to use in the event that there's a warranty. So you sometimes find in relation to certain developments where, let's say there's a 20% deposit and 10% of that is protected by a warranty, you find that 10% is released as agent to the developer and the remaining 10% will be held as stakeholder to ensure that all of the deposit funds are going to be protected for the investor.
Great. Okay, there's another question that's coming is that, is there any other restrictions when it comes to a foreign purchase of the property in UK?
Is there any other restrictions in relation to?
Any restrictions on the foreign buyers when it comes to invest in UK? There's no other restrictions, right? As long as you pay your tax.
Yeah, this was one of the few guaranteed things in life. No, there's no restrictions in relation to that, in relation to your investment in the UK. With that said, obviously there's going to be certain documentation you're going to need to provide to your solicitor for them to be able to verify, say, the source of the funds, your identity, proof of address, that type of thing. So your solicitor themselves will have their own anti-money laundering obligations that they have. But no, there wouldn't be any specific restrictions on certain regions and that type of thing.
Okay, so do they need to, can they do the e-signing? Because as at now that no one can actually travel to UK and sign the contract and execute the contract. So can they just do some e-signing with the solicitors over the line or Zoom or whatsoever?
Yeah, you are finding that more and more common now, especially obviously in the current economic climate with the pandemic going. The e-signatures are becoming more and more common in relation to these kinds of transactions. With that said, it's less common in relation to what's known as deeds. So when it comes to completion, say you're executing a lease that's going to be signed as a deed, what you're finding is that they have to be witnessed. A lot of those are either signed in person and then posted to the solicitors, which can cause a slight delay depending on where the investor is. But for the contracts themselves, you're finding e-signatures being more and more common. And once they're verified, they're just as lawfully binding as a normal signature.
Okay. There's another question that is coming from, is like, for cash buyers, would it be difficult to pass the AML for overseas buyers?
No, not necessarily, provided that you can provide some kind of source of the funds, whether that be a bank statement or confirmation as to the source of the funds effectively, and you can provide your proof of ID and proof of address. And no, it's not a huge hurdle to overcome, provided you've got everything in place. and you're very, very honest with your solicitor.
Okay. And it's not necessary to open an account prior to the settlements, right? So the
You
fund
mean
can be
like a UK account?
Yes.
No, no. You see, especially in relation to your larger law firms that are going to be dealing with these kind of transactions, they have the means capabilities of attaining funds from overseas, whether that be through a SWIFT or an IBAN or something of that nature. So no, you wouldn't need a UK bank account, provided you're able to obviously confirm the source of the funds.
Oh, okay. Okay, when come to exit, it's the same thing as well, right? You make sure you pay your tax or whatsoever, the transfer and everything before you can exit and complete the transactions and all these things.
Yes.
Any others that you want to highlight on the exit part?
In relation to tax, now I'm not a tax specialist, and obviously we've always encouraged people to deal with independent financial advisors. With that said, obviously there's a couple of key taxes in relation to property transactions. Obviously you've got your stamp duty. Now, to even register you as the registered proprietor or the owner of the property, you'd need to pay your stamp duty, because you have a stamp duty return certificate with them, which is there. There's obviously other taxes to be considerable of in relation to when you're disposing of the property or when you're selling the property on. Obviously including things like capital gains tax, income tax for obviously any income that you generated over the term of your ownership of the property, and then obviously in the unfortunate event, inheritance tax for in the event that you're passing it on to, say, children or any other beneficiary.
But inheritance tax, there's actually I would say that it's a cap, right? What is the amount like for the inheritance tax, the cap?
There's a threshold. As I said, it's not my
threshold.
specialty area, and inheritance tax is notoriously complex. But with that said, it's my understanding that there is a threshold in relation to inheritance tax, of which, provided you are below the certain amount, then obviously you fall below that threshold and you fall within what's the 0% margin.
Yep, that's great. Okay, let's see any more questions from the audience. Okay, for those who have questions, again, if we can't able to answer you, you can always drop in the comment box. We will try to get back to you. And meanwhile, we will probably put up Joshua's contact number or email address in the events that you probably have more questions with regards to the property laws and the contracts or whatsoever. You can actually get hold of Joshua, and I'm sure he will be able to provide a good service to you as well. Yep. Anything on to add on before we end our program?
Just thank you very much for having me. Yeah, as I said, if there's any watchers at the minute that do have any queries, or there isn't something that you'd like explaining in more detail, just feel free to either drop me an email, give me a call, and obviously I'll get that addressed for you. But yeah, thank you very much for having me on Monday. Yeah,
thanks for your time. I know that you are extremely busy, especially during this period of time, and you spend so much time to elaborate all these terms and conditions and the requirements when it comes to invest in property in UK. Thank you very much. Take care and stay safe. Hope you have a nice day. Yeah.
Bye-bye. Yeah, bye.